Rick's protégée smirked as she told him I should focus on gardening instead of job hunting at my age. 3 weeks later, her expression crumbled when she discovered I was the new director of the pension fund that managed his retirement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Sycamore restaurant was exactly as I remembered, soft. Amber lighting casting warm shadows across crisp white tablecloths, the gentle clink of silverware against fine china, creating a symphony of refined dining. The scent of seared meats and aromatic herbs wafted through the air, reminding me why this had always been our special occasion spot. Yet tonight, it felt different. I hadn't been here in almost 8 months, not since that dinner when my life had veered in an unexpected direction. That evening, I'd sat across from Rick, sharing my dreams of returning to the financial sector after taking time off to care for my mother. But today, I wasn't the same Linda who had watched her husband dismiss those aspirations with a wave of his hand and a patronizing smile. Tonight, I walked in alone, not out of loneliness, but by choice. This was my evening, a quiet celebration of the success that had seemed impossible 8 months ago. No company was needed, no validation required, just me, my thoughts, and the satisfaction of knowing I had rebuilt something worth celebrating. As the host led me to my table, I took in the familiar surroundings. The grand fireplace along the far wall cast a golden glow across the room, catching in the crystal pendants of the chandeliers overhead. The space had a timeless elegance, much like the career I had cultivated before stepping away to become a caregiver. Then I heard his voice. I froze, not outwardly but internally, as if time had suspended itself for just a moment. Rick. The sound of his laughter carried effortlessly through the room, merging with the ambient chatter like an unwelcome intrusion. And then another voice joined his, a woman's. I forced myself to exhale, releasing the tension that had suddenly gathered in my shoulders. This wasn't unexpected. Rick had always surrounded himself with people who reinforced his worldview, particularly at work. Collins Manufacturing had been his domain for 20 years, and he'd built quite the circle of admiration there. The Sycamore has the best wine selection in Oakwood Heights, hands down, the woman's voice declared, confident and assured. I didn't turn immediately. Instead, I reached for my water glass, taking a slow sip before finally allowing my gaze to drift across the room. There he was, Rick seated at a table just 2 over from mine, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed as always, that familiar self-satisfied expression resting comfortably on his face. He leaned slightly toward the woman beside him, Megan. I presumed from the way he'd described his ambitious young colleague months ago. She was striking, professionally polished with sleek dark hair cut in a sharp bob, impeccable makeup, and the kind of self-assured posture that came from never having your competence questioned. She dressed well in a tailored blazer that suggested career focus without sacrificing femininity. She was exactly the type Rick would mentor, young, deferential to him yet confident around others, career-oriented but not threatening to his position. And she was looking directly at me. "Oh," she mused, tilting her head slightly. "I think I recognize you." I offered a polite, impassive smile. "Do you?" Rick's gaze followed hers, and for the first time that evening, his easy confidence faltered. I saw the moment of recognition flash in his eyes, the way his fingers tightened slightly around his glass of scotch. He hadn't expected to see me here, not at the Sycamore on a Tuesday evening. That alone gave me a quiet satisfaction. Megan, however, didn't notice the subtle shift in his demeanor. She leaned forward slightly, a friendly yet evaluating smile playing on her lips. "Yes, you're Rick's wife, aren't you? Linda, right?" The word wife hung in the air, delivered with a slight emphasis that suggested more than simple identification. I could have responded in many ways, ignored the undertone, changed the subject, even walked away. Instead, I set my glass down carefully, meeting her gaze with composed dignity. That's one way to put it. Rick cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. Linda, what a surprise. Megan and I are just discussing the Carter project. But Megan wasn't interested in his attempt to redirect. She was enjoying this chance encounter too much. Rick has mentioned you before. Didn't you used to work in finance or something? Years ago? I arched an eyebrow. Finance, yes. Her smile widened, but there was an edge to it now, something sharper behind the professional veneer. That's right. It's just interesting how things change, isn't it? Some of us are building careers while others find different paths. Rick exhaled quietly, shaking his head as if trying to prevent whatever was unfolding. But I wasn't upset, not even close. I had walked into the Sycamore with a quiet purpose, content to enjoy my evening in solitude. But now, with Megan sitting nearby, so eager to establish her position in some imagined hierarchy, I saw an opportunity for something more meaningful than anger or defensiveness. Different paths indeed, I said smoothly, lifting my glass once, more. Megan seemed to take my measured response as a victory. She straightened, reaching for her wine as she cast Rick a knowing glance. I completely understand. Not everyone has the stamina for today's financial sector. Rick was just saying how demanding the new Collins pension fund restructuring has been. We've been putting in 60-hour weeks. Rick shifted again, visibly uncomfortable, but Megan continued, too invested in her performance to notice his signals. Some people just have more to offer in the current market, she added, her voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. It takes a certain energy to keep up with all the changes. Then the moment happened. A server approached my table, leaning in with practiced professionalism. Ms. Thompson, would you prefer to review the Q2 projections before or after your meal? Mr. Wilson sent them over and mentioned you might want to look at them tonight. Silence fell. For the first time that evening, Megan hesitated. She blinked, glancing between me and the server, her confidence faltering for the briefest moment. Projections? She repeated, her voice noticeably softer. I smiled just enough, not gloating, simply acknowledging. The quarterly pension fund. Projections, I clarified. After dinner would be fine, thank you. But it was already too late. The shift had occurred. Megan looked at Rick, expecting an explanation. He said nothing, his expression frozen somewhere between recognition and resignation. I could see the questions forming in her mind, the slow realization taking shape. Wait, she said finally. What does he mean? Pension fund projections? I set my glass down, taking my time before responding, letting the moment build naturally. Oh, I said, tilting my head slightly. Rick didn't mention my new position? Megan's expression darkened. What position? I met Rick's gaze, watching as his jaw tightened just slightly. A tell from 20 years of marriage that I recognized instantly. Then I turned back to Megan, delivering the information with simple clarity. I'm the new director of Meridian, Financial Group's Institutional Investment Division. We manage the Collins Manufacturing Pension Fund. The weight of those words settled over their table. Megan's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Rick exhaled, his expression unreadable. I simply returned to my meal, cutting into my perfectly cooked steak as if this were any ordinary dinner conversation. Because true confidence never needs to announce itself, it simply exists. Megan's wine glass remained suspended halfway to her lips, her fingers rigid around the delicate stem as my words registered fully. I had given her just enough time to process what I'd said, to feel the implications settling in her mind. I am the new director of the division that manages the Collins Manufacturing Pension Fund. The flicker of confusion in her eyes transformed into something sharper, more alert as she looked to Rick for confirmation or denial. He didn't provide either. Instead, he sat completely still, his earlier easy manner replaced by a stiffness that spoke volumes. The playful confidence Megan had worn so effortlessly just moments ago was slipping, her smile faltering at the edges as realization dawned. I speared a piece of asparagus with my fork, taking an unhurried bite of my meal, calm and collected in the silence I'd created. I had no need to rush this moment or fill the space with unnecessary words. "You're the director? At Meridian?" she finally managed, her voice slightly higher than before. I lifted my gaze to meet hers, allowing the silence to stretch just a moment longer before responding. "That's right. I joined 3 weeks ago." I took a sip of my water. The Collins Fund is one of our largest accounts. Rick suddenly seemed very interested in adjusting his cufflinks. "Linda has extensive experience in institutional finance," he offered stiffly, as if this explained everything and nothing at once. Megan tried to recover, straightening her posture and forcing brightness back into her voice. "Well, that's unexpected. Congratulations." The words sounded hollow, mechanical. "I had no idea you were still active in the industry." I smiled, lightly. "There's quite a bit about me you don't know, Megan." She swallowed, her composure cracking just enough to be visible. "I suppose not." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rick mentioned you'd stepped back from your career some time ago. "I took time off to care for my mother," I corrected gently. "There's a difference between a pause and an ending." Rick cleared his throat. "Linda has always been quite ambitious." His tone carried a strange mix of acknowledgement and discomfort. This wasn't how he'd framed my career aspirations 8 months ago, when he'd laughed and suggested I was too old to compete with the young talent entering the field. Megan's mind was clearly racing, recalibrating everything she thought she knew. "So you oversee our pension investments? All of them?" "Every dollar," I confirmed. "In fact, I'm meeting with your CFO tomorrow to discuss the fund's performance metrics and future allocation strategies." The realization visibly washed over her. This woman who had moments ago implied I was past my professional prime now understood she'd been casually dismissing someone with direct influence over her financial future. The dynamic had completely inverted. "I'm sure you'll provide excellent guidance," she offered weakly. I dabbed my napkin against my lips. "I take the responsibility very seriously. People's retirements depend on sound management and ethical oversight." The emphasis wasn't lost on either of them. Rick shifted uncomfortably while Megan's eyes widened slightly. Without being explicit, I had made it clear that any professional preferential treatment would be not only inappropriate, but potentially unethical. A subtle reminder of boundaries that suddenly mattered very much. A server approached with a bottle of wine, presenting it with quiet deference. "Compliments of Mr. Wilson, Ms. Thompson. He thought you might enjoy this selection with your meal." It was a small gesture but profoundly significant in the moment. Visible acknowledgement of my position and professional relationships. I thanked the server as he poured a glass, further underscoring the new reality. Megan watched this interaction with an expression I recognized all too well, the look of someone rapidly reassessing where they stood. She had entered the Sycamore, believing she understood the hierarchy. Her rising star aligned with Rick's established position, both of them worlds above a woman she assumed had been relegated to domestic life. Now she sat silently processing the truth, that I occupied a position that oversaw millions of dollars, including the very funds that would someday support Rick's retirement. "I should probably review those quarterly numbers tonight after all," I said to the server. "Would you have them bring the portfolio to my table in about 20 minutes?" "Of course, Ms. Thompson." Rick was now visibly uncomfortable, running a finger inside his collar as if it had suddenly tightened. "You're working on a Tuesday night? I thought this was supposed to be your dinner out." It was the first personal comment he'd made, small attempt to reclaim some familiarity. I met his gaze with polite detachment. "Some of us still have the stamina for it," I replied, echoing Megan's earlier words with just enough emphasis to make my point. The reference wasn't lost on either of them. Megan's cheeks flushed slightly while Rick's jaw tightened. The table between them fell silent, the earlier animation of their business discussion thoroughly extinguished. I returned to my meal, taking measured bites and savoring the flavors. This wasn't about gloating or revenge. It was about reclaiming my narrative. For too long, Rick had defined me to others, diminishing my professional achievements, framing my career break as retirement, suggesting my skills were outdated. He'd created a convenient story where my ambitions were unrealistic, even slightly pathetic, a middle-aged woman who couldn't accept her obsolescence. Now, without raising my voice or making a scene, I had shattered that fiction completely. As I finished my meal, I noticed Megan checking her phone with increased frequency, her earlier enthusiasm for the dinner clearly waning. Rick kept glancing at his watch, likely eager for an exit that wouldn't appear too hasty. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that even remaining in the same restaurant now felt uncomfortable for them. I signaled for the check, watching as the server approached with a respectful nod. "Actually, Ms. Thompson, your dinner has been taken care of," Mr. Wilson called ahead. I smiled, gathering my purse as I prepared to leave. "Please thank him for me." I stood, smoothing my dress before turning toward Rick and Megan's table one. "Last time." "It was nice running into you both," I said with professional courtesy. "Rick, I'll see you at home later. Megan, I'm sure we'll be in touch through work channels." The subtle reminder of our interconnected professional and personal lives wasn't accidental. As I walked toward the exit, I felt their eyes following me. Megan trying to process what this meant for her carefully cultivated relationship with my husband, and Rick confronting the reality that the woman he'd dismissed so easily now held significant influence in his professional sphere. I stepped out, into the cool evening air, taking a deep breath as the door closed behind me. This encounter hadn't been planned, but it had provided something I hadn't realized I needed. Not revenge, but restoration. The narrative was mine again. The truth, visible for all to see, and that was more satisfying than any planned confrontation could have been. The next morning, I arrived at Meridian Financial's sleek glass headquarters just after 7, the early sunlight reflecting off the building's exterior as I made my way through the lobby. The security guard greeted me by name, and the elevator whisked me to the executive floor where my corner office overlooked the cityscape. 3 weeks into the position, and it already felt right. The purposeful energy, the mental challenges, the sense of meaningful work. My assistant, Kevin, was already at his desk, organizing materials for the morning's meetings. "The Collins Manufacturing CFO confirmed for 9 o'clock, he informed me, handing over a freshly updated portfolio analysis. "And James wants a quick word before they arrive." I nodded, scanning the numbers that represented thousands of workers' financial futures, including Rick's. James Wilson, Meridian's CEO, had personally recruited me for this position after we'd worked together 15 years earlier. He'd remembered my analytical skills and ethical approach long after our paths had diverged. "Linda," James greeted me, appearing in my doorway. At 60, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Ready for Collins today?" "Absolutely," I replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. "Their allocation model needs modernization, but I think they'll be receptive to our approach." He nodded, studying me with a knowing expression. "I ran into Rick last night. Quite the coincidence." I allowed myself a small smile. "The Sycamore." "Yes, quite unexpected." "He seemed surprised by your new role." "He's had difficulty adjusting to the idea of my return to finance," I acknowledged. James leaned back. "His loss is our gain. The board was impressed with your restructuring proposal. 8 months is nothing in this industry. Your skills and experience are as sharp as ever. 8 months. The same period Rick had insisted would make me irrelevant in the market, too old to compete with young blood like Megan. How quickly those arguments had collapsed when tested against reality. My phone buzzed with a text from Rick. "We should talk about last night. Dinner tonight?" I set the phone aside. That conversation could wait. Right now, I had a pension fund to restructure. When the Collins manufacturing executives arrived, I greeted them with professional warmth, laying out binders containing our analysis and recommendations. Their CFO, Douglas Hayes, seemed particularly interested in our approach. "Meridian's reputation for stable growth is impressive," he noted as we reviewed the numbers. "What changes do you envision for our fund?" For the next hour, I outlined a strategy that balanced innovation with security, explaining complex financial concepts with clarity and confidence. These were the same skills Rick had dismissed as outdated, yet the Collins team was hanging on every word. As the meeting concluded, Hayes shook my hand firmly. "This is the kind of leadership our fund has needed. I look forward to working closely with you, Ms. Thompson." The irony wasn't lost on me. While Rick had been telling me I was too old to compete, I was being handed direct oversight of his financial future, not through manipulation or politics, but through genuine expertise and hard work. As I walked the executives to the elevator, I noticed a familiar figure waiting in the reception area. Megan. She stood as our group approached, visibly uncomfortable, yet maintaining a professional demeanor. "Ms. Parker," I greeted her with neutral professionalism. "Are you here for the allocation meeting?" She nodded stiffly. "Yes, Mr. Hayes asked me to join as liaison for the Employee Benefits Committee." I introduced her to the group, careful to maintain perfect professional courtesy. "Ms. Parker works closely with my husband at Collins. She's quite knowledgeable about the company culture." The meeting room fell silent as we all took our seats, Megan positioned directly across from me. The younger woman who had so confidently dismissed my relevance now required to engage with me as the authority on her financial future. As the EI presentation continued, I noticed her watching me closely, studying how I commanded the room, how the executives deferred to my expertise. The woman who had suggested I focus on gardening instead of job hunting was witnessing firsthand exactly what I brought to the table. When questions turned to specific fund allocations, I directed several to her, professionally including her, in the discussion. "Ms. Parker, as employee liaison, what feedback have you received about the current investment options?" She answered competently, if somewhat cautiously, clearly unsure of how to navigate our new professional dynamic. With each interaction, the message became clearer. I wasn't interested in embarrassing her or creating conflict. I simply expected the same professional respect I was extending. By meeting's end, something had shifted in her demeanor. The dismissive confidence was gone, replaced by something closer to genuine professional regard. As the room cleared, she lingered, gathering her notes with deliberate slowness. "Ms. Thompson," she began, her voice lacking its earlier bravado, "I wanted to apologize for my comments last night. They were inappropriate and uninformed." I considered her for a moment. "Professional relationships require mutual respect, Megan. Assumptions about someone's capabilities based on age or circumstance are rarely accurate." She nodded, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I've learned that quite clearly today." "Good," I replied simply, "because I'll be overseeing this pension fund for the foreseeable future, and we'll be working together regularly." The implications settled between us. This wasn't a one-time encounter, but a long-term professional relationship where she would consistently report to me on matters affecting her colleagues' financial security. The hierarchy she had assumed was permanently inverted. "I understand," she said quietly. "And I actually think I could learn a lot from you." It was the first genuinely humble thing she'd said to me, free from the competitive edge that had characterized our previous interactions. "We all have something to learn from each other," I acknowledged. "Experience has value. So does fresh perspective. Neither should be dismissed." As she left, I noticed a text from Rick. "Can we talk before dinner? I'm leaving work early." I responded with a simple yes, knowing that our conversation was long overdue. That evening, I arrived home to find Rick waiting in the living room, a glass of scotch in hand and an uncharacteristic nervousness in his posture. "You could have told me," he said as I set down my briefcase. "About Meridian?" I hung up my coat. "I tried to, Rick, several times." He had the decency to look uncomfortable, remembering the dinner conversations he'd cut short, the career updates he'd dismissed as pipe dreams. "I never thought you'd actually—" He trailed off. "Be hired as a director? Return to finance? Succeed?" I supplied the endings he couldn't seem to voice. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Linda, you have to understand how this looks. My wife overseeing my pension fund? People are already talking." "About what, specifically?" I asked, my tone measured. "About my qualifications? My experience? Or about the fact that 8 months ago, you told me I was too old to re-enter?" "The workforce?" The words hung between us, finally spoken aloud after simmering beneath the surface for so long. "I was trying to protect you from disappointment," he claimed, but the excuse sounded hollow even to him. "No, Rick. You were protecting yourself from having to reconsider how you see me. It was easier to dismiss my ambitions than to support them." He stared into his glass. "And now you're my pension fund director. It's humiliating." I studied him, this man I'd shared 20 years with, whose respect I'd somehow lost without ever meaning to. "This isn't about humiliating you," I said quietly. "This is about me reclaiming a career I love. The fact that it intersects with your company is coincidence." "Coincidence?" he scoffed. "James Wilson personally recruited you." "Yes, because we worked together at Morgan Stanley 15 years ago, and he valued my expertise. My career existed before you decided it was over, Rick." The truth of that statement seemed to finally reach him. For perhaps the first time, he was seeing me clearly, not as his wife who had stepped away from her career, but as a financial professional whose identity had never actually disappeared. "Megan said you were impressive today," he admitted, reluctantly. "The CFO is apparently singing your praises." I nodded, accepting this information without surprise. "Because I'm good at what I do. I always have been." Rick set down his glass, the defensive posture gradually giving way to something more contemplative. "I guess I never really understood what your work meant to you." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." We sat in silence for a moment, the years between us filled with assumptions and misunderstandings that had led us here. "So what happens now?" he finally asked. It was a question with many layers, about our marriage, our individual paths, our shared future. Professionally, nothing changes. I'll manage the Collins Fund with the same ethical oversight I apply to all our accounts. No special treatment, no conflicts of interest. I paused. "Personally, that depends on whether you can see me differently now." His gaze met mine, recognition dawning that the woman he had tried to confine to a comfortable domestic role had never actually been that person at all. "I'm trying," he said quietly. It wasn't a promise of transformation, but it was a beginning. An acknowledgement that perhaps he had been wrong about what I was capable of, about who I still was beneath the roles of wife and caretaker. In the weeks that followed, our relationship shifted gradually. Rick stopped making dismissive comments about my late career revival and began asking genuine questions about my work. Megan's attitude transformed from condescension to respectful collegiality. Most importantly, I found myself thriving in the role that had once seemed impossible to reclaim. 6 months later, as I presented Meridian's annual performance review, to the Collins board, I caught Rick watching me from the back of the room. There was something new in his expression, not just acceptance, but pride. The journey back to my career hadn't been about proving him wrong. It had been about reclaiming my own narrative, my own worth. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in confrontation, but in quiet competence, in showing rather than telling, in succeeding despite doubts rather than arguing against them. 8 months earlier, Rick had told me I was too old to work in modern finance. Now, as I guided his company's pension fund toward record growth, those words had dissolved into nothing, replaced by the undeniable evidence of what had always been true. Capability doesn't expire with age, and the greatest comeback often begins when someone tells you it's impossible. Thank you for joining me for this story of professional resilience and quiet triumph. If you found value in this narrative about reclaiming your power and proving your worth through actions rather than arguments, please consider subscribing. It's free, and it helps us share more empowering stories with our community. Stay focused on your path, even when others can't see where it leads. Proceed with Part 2. Make sure that each part is at least 4,000 words. Remove bracket. Do not put bullet or numbering, make it paragraph always. Do not mention the previous parts. Do not mention subscribing to channel. Proceed directly to story. Also, do not repeat the story and phrases from the previous stories. The morning after. Our unexpected encounter at the Sycamore. I arrived at Meridian Financial's glass tower just as dawn broke over the city skyline. The lobby was quiet, only a few early arrivers nodding respectfully as I made my way to the executive elevator. My corner office on the 32nd floor offered a sweeping view of Oakwood Heights, the same town where Rick and I had built our life together, though from this vantage point, everything looked different. Smaller, more manageable, part of a larger landscape I could now navigate with confidence. I settled at my desk, reviewing the Collins Manufacturing Pension Fund documents before their team arrived. The fund had been underperforming for years, its allocation models outdated, its growth stagnant. This wasn't just about numbers on a page. These were people's futures, their security, their dignity in retirement, including Rick's. James appeared in my doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. Thought you might need this. Big meeting today. I accepted the cup gratefully. Thanks. I've identified several areas where we can improve their returns without increasing risk exposure. He nodded, leaning against the doorframe. That's why I brought you on board. Nobody understands institutional risk management like you do. He paused, studying me. How was the impromptu reunion last night? I took a careful sip before answering. Illuminating. For everyone involved. James chuckled. I imagine so. Rick called me this morning, you know. This surprised me. Did he? Wanted to know how long I'd been planning to recruit you. Seemed to think this was some elaborate scheme. I shook my head. Of course he did. I told him the truth, that I'd been following your career for 15 years, that your sabbatical to care for your mother hadn't diminished your expertise, and that when I needed someone to overhaul our institutional division, you were my first call. James straightened. I also mentioned that his company's pension fund was only one of 27 accounts you manage, despite what his ego might suggest. I couldn't help but smile. James had always been direct. It was one of his most valuable qualities as a mentor and colleague. The Collins team will be here in 30 minutes, he added. Including your dinner companions from last night. Both of them? Apparently, Ms. Parker has been added to their benefits committee. Recent promotion. His knowing look told me everything. Rick had arranged for Megan to attend, likely hoping her presence would somehow unsettle me. How convenient, I murmured, turning back to my notes. Will that be a problem? James asked. I met his gaze steadily. Not for me. When the Collins delegation arrived, I greeted them in the conference room with professional warmth. Douglas Hayes, their CFO, led the group, followed by their benefits director and 3 committee members. Rick entered last, with Megan close behind, both carefully maintaining neutral expressions that didn't quite mask their discomfort. "Thank you all for coming," I began, directing them to the presentation materials at each seat. "Today we'll be reviewing your current pension allocation model and discussing Meridian's recommendations for improving performance over the next 5 years." For the next hour, I walked them through a detailed analysis of their fund, identifying inefficiencies, highlighting missed opportunities, and outlining a strategy that would increase returns while maintaining security. I noticed Megan watching me closely, studying my command of the material, the way executives twice her age deferred to my expertise. Rick kept his gaze fixed on the presentation, avoiding direct eye contact. "As you can see on page 17, I continued, "your current domestic equity allocation is overweighted in traditional manufacturing sectors, creating vulnerability to market shifts. We recommend redistributing approximately 20% toward emerging technologies and sustainable energy, areas showing consistent growth patterns even during economic downturns." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "This is the most comprehensive analysis we've seen. Your reputation for thorough risk assessment is well-deserved, Ms. Thompson." "Thank you. We believe transparency is essential when managing people's financial futures." I turned a page in the presentation. "Now, regarding your international exposure." The meeting continued with technical questions and detailed discussions. Throughout, I maintained perfect professionalism, never acknowledging the personal connection to Rick except when making formal introductions. Yet the irony hung in the air. The woman he had dismissed as too old for the financial sector was now explaining complex investment strategies that would directly impact his retirement security. When we reached the Q&A portion, I deliberately called on Megan. "Ms. Parker, as employee representative, what concerns have been raised about the current fund performance?" She straightened, clearly caught off guard by the direct address. "Well, there's been growing anxiety about whether the fund will support adequate retirement benefits, especially for middle management positions." Her eyes flickered briefly toward Rick. "Many feel the returns haven't kept pace with comparable companies." "A valid concern," I acknowledged. "Our proposal addresses precisely that issue. With proper allocation adjustments, we project a 30% improvement in performance over 5 years without increasing risk exposure." Rick finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "These projections seem optimistic given current market conditions." I met his gaze directly for the first time that morning. "They're actually conservative, Mr. Thompson. Our models account for 3 potential market corrections during the projected period. I'd be happy to walk you through the stress test scenarios we've applied." He didn't challenge further, instead nodding stiffly and returning to his notes. As the meeting concluded, Hayes approached me with genuine enthusiasm. "This is exactly the kind of leadership our fund has needed, Ms. Thompson. The board will be impressed with your approach." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Meridian values the trust you've placed in us." I noticed Rick lingering as others filed out, clearly waiting for a private moment. When the room had emptied except for us, he closed the door. "Was this your plan all along?" he asked, his voice low. I gathered my materials calmly. "What exactly are you implying, Rick?" "This." He gestured around the conference room. "Taking control of my company's pension fund right after our disagreement about your career." I set down my portfolio, giving him my full attention. "My position at Meridian has nothing to do with you. James offered me this role because of my 20 years of institutional finance experience. Experience you conveniently forgot when you told me I was past my prime and should focus on gardening, instead of competing with younger talent." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. That was a private conversation between husband and wife. Yes, it was. And I'm keeping our professional interactions exactly that, professional. The fact that Collins Manufacturing happens to be one of our clients is coincidental. Coincidental? He repeated skeptically. Yes, Rick. Contrary to what you might believe, not everything revolves around you or your company. I manage 26 other institutional accounts, most significantly larger than Collins. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. You could have told me about this position. I tried, several times. You changed the subject, dismissed it as a pipe, or suggested I was setting myself up for rejection. I closed my laptop. Eventually, I stopped trying to make you understand what was important to me. A knock at the door interrupted us. Megan stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. Excuse me, the car is waiting, Rick. He nodded stiffly. We'll continue this discussion at home, he said to me before following Megan out. I remained in the conference room, looking out over the city skyline. This confrontation had been inevitable, but it wasn't the one I had anticipated. All those months ago when he'd laughed at my ambitions, I had imagined proving him wrong through argument, through persuasion. Instead, I had done something far more powerful. I had simply shown him the truth through action. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Board was impressed with your presentation. Hayes already called to approve the reallocation strategy. I smiled, gathering my things. This validation, professional, objective, based on merit, was worth more than any argument I could have won at home. That evening, I deliberately worked late, knowing Rick would be waiting. When I finally arrived home after 8, he was sitting in the living room, nursing a scotch. The lights dimmed to create an atmosphere that seemed both intimate and confrontational. We need to talk about what this means, he said as I set down my briefcase. What means, specifically? I hung, my coat in the closet, maintaining the calm demeanor that had become my professional signature. You, managing my pension fund? He set down his glass. It creates complications. I took a seat across from him. Only if we make it complicated. Professionally, our relationship is clear. Meridian manages Collins's pension assets, and I oversee that relationship as division director. Personally, we're husband and wife navigating a shifting dynamic in our marriage. Shifting dynamic, he repeated. That's one way to put it. How would you put it, Rick? He leaned forward, elbows on knees. 8 months ago, you were focused on family, on home. Then suddenly you're talking about returning to finance, competing with people half your age. I expressed concern, realistic concern, about the challenges you'd face. You dismissed me, I corrected gently. There's a difference between expressing concern and telling someone they're too old to pursue their passion. I was trying to protect you. From what? Success? Fulfillment? Financial? Independence? The question hung between us, more revealing than perhaps he intended. Rick had always seen himself as the provider, the career-focused partner. My ambition had disrupted that narrative. I didn't want you to be disappointed, he said finally. The financial world has changed since you were last in it. Yes, it has. That's why I spent 6 months updating my certifications, studying market trends, and reconnecting with industry contacts before applying for positions. I held his, did you know that? Did you ever ask how I was preparing for this transition? His silence was answer enough. This isn't about you protecting me, Rick. It's about you struggling to see me as something other than your wife who took a career break to care for family. He stood, moving to refill his glass. And now you're what? My boss? No. I'm a financial professional whose responsibilities include overseeing your company's pension assets. One of 27 accounts I manage. People are already talking, he muttered. Hayes mentioned how interesting it is that my wife is directing our pension investments. And is the fund performing better under my direction? He hesitated. Early indicators are positive. Then that's all that matters professionally. I stood, moving closer. Rick, this doesn't have to be adversarial. My success doesn't diminish yours. He looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps seeing for the first time the woman I had always been beneath the roles of wife and caregiver. Megan says you're brilliant, that your presentation was the most comprehensive analysis she's ever seen. The admission clearly cost him something. I accepted it with a simple nod. I just need to understand, he continued, why this matters so much to you. We're comfortable financially. You don't need to work. Need and want are different things. This isn't about money. It's about purpose, identity, using the skills I've spent decades developing. I paused. Would you be content spending your days gardening and volunteering, knowing you had expertise that was sitting dormant? He didn't answer immediately, and in that silence I sensed the first real consideration he'd given to my perspective. I guess I never thought about it that way, he admitted finally. I know, and that's part of the problem. I moved toward the stairs. I have an early meeting tomorrow. We can continue this discussion another time if you'd like. He nodded, something shifting in his expression. Not quite understanding, not yet respect, but perhaps the beginning of recognition that the woman he'd married was more complex than the role she'd temporarily embraced. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to both my professional and personal life. At Meridian, I immersed myself in revitalizing not just the Collins Fund, but all 27 institutional accounts under my management. Performance indicators rose steadily, earning commendations from the board and expanding my influence within the organization. At home, Rick and I maintained a careful civility, neither of us pushing too hard on the tender spots in our relationship. He stopped making dismissive comments about my late career revival and began asking occasional questions about my work, surface-level inquiries, but a start nonetheless. Then came the quarterly review meeting with Collins Manufacturing. I arrived early to prepare the conference room, arranging presentation materials at each seat and reviewing the growth metrics we would be celebrating. The fund had shown remarkable improvement in just 3 months, a testament to the allocation adjustments I'd implemented. Hayes entered first, followed by his team. Rick arrived last, and I noticed immediately that Megan wasn't with him. Ms. Parker couldn't make it? I asked as everyone settled in. Hayes shook his head. She's been reassigned to the Production Oversight Committee, internal restructuring. I caught Rick's gaze briefly, sensing there was more to the story, but maintained professional focus as we began the presentation. As you can see from the quarterly performance indicators, the fund has already shown a 12% improvement following our reallocation strategy. This puts us well ahead of projections for the first year. The meeting proceeded smoothly, with genuine enthusiasm from the Collins team about the fund's performance. Throughout, I noticed Rick watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Not resentment, not quite admiration, but something closer to reassessment. When the meeting concluded, Hayes lingered to discuss potential additional services Meridian might provide. Your expertise has made a remarkable difference, Ms. Thompson. The board is extremely pleased. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. We value the partnership we're building. As the room cleared, Rick approached. Do you have a moment? I nodded, gesturing, for him to stay as others filed out. The performance numbers are impressive, he said once we were alone. Hayes can't stop talking about the Thompson approach to institutional management. I'm glad the results are satisfying. Rick hesitated. Megan's reassignment wasn't coincidental. I requested her removal from the benefits committee. This surprised me. Why? Because her presence was complicating both our professional and personal situations. He straightened a stack of presentations, not meeting my eye. And because she made inappropriate comments about you that reflected poorly on the company. I waited, sensing there was more. After seeing your presentation, She suggested your appointment might be personally motivated rather than merit-based. His jaw tightened. I informed her that questioning the qualifications of Meridian's directors based on gender or age was not acceptable at Collins Manufacturing. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, Rick defending my professional credentials when he had dismissed them himself months earlier. That must have been an interesting conversation, I observed. A faint smile crossed his face. Let's just say it was a learning opportunity for both of us. It was a small moment, but significant, an acknowledgement, however subtle, that his own perspective had been flawed. Would you like to have dinner tonight? He asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. There's a new place downtown that's supposed to be excellent. It was the first social invitation he'd extended since my appointment at Meridian. I'd like that. That evening, we sat across from each other at Emilio's, a new Italian restaurant with warm lighting and quiet sophistication. The setting felt neutral, neither the Sycamore with its complicated associations, nor our home with its emerging tensions. I recommended Megan for a leadership program at corporate, Rick said as we were served appetizers. She has potential but needs broader perspective. I nodded, appreciating the subtext. Everyone has something to learn. Experience has value, and so does fresh thinking. He studied me for a moment. You know, watching you in that meeting today, it was like seeing someone I've known for 20 years in a completely different light. I haven't changed, Rick. This part of me has always existed. I know that now. He seemed to choose his next words carefully. I think I got comfortable with the version of you that existed. In relation to me, wife, home manager, support system. It was easier than acknowledging the full person. It was more insight than I had expected, more self-awareness than he had shown in months. And now? Now I'm trying to see the whole picture. He reached for his wine. It's not always comfortable, realizing you've had a limited view of someone you thought you knew completely. Growth rarely is comfortable, I offered, for either of us. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but something had changed. A door had opened to genuine communication rather than defensive positioning. By dessert, we were discussing future possibilities with a candor that had been absent for too long. James mentioned the London conference next month, Rick said as we shared tiramisu. Are you presenting? Yes. Our approach to pension fund revitalization has drawn international interest. He nodded, considering this. I'd like to hear your presentation, if that wouldn't be awkward. I looked at him with surprise. You want to attend a 3-day institutional finance conference? I want to understand your world, he said simply. I've spent too long not doing that. It was a small offering, but significant, an acknowledgement that my professional identity deserved not just acceptance, but active engagement. Back at home, as we prepared for bed in the quiet rhythm of a long married couple, Rick paused by the bathroom door. I was wrong, Linda, he said quietly. About you being too old for this, about your capabilities, about what you needed. He met my gaze in the mirror. I'm sorry. The words I had once thought would feel like victory instead felt like the beginning of reconciliation, not just with Rick, but with the complexity of being a woman reclaiming her power at an age when society often suggests stepping back. Thank you for saying that. He nodded, the conversation complete yet ongoing in ways that would likely unfold for months to come. The following Monday, I arrived at Meridian to find James waiting in my office, an unusual expression on his face. Everything all right? I asked, setting down my briefcase. More than all right. The board reviewed our quarterly performance yesterday. He handed me a folder. Your division showed the strongest growth in the company's history for a 3-month period. I opened the folder to find performance metrics confirming what I already knew. The institutional accounts under my management had significantly outperformed industry averages. "They've approved the expansion proposal," James continued. "You'll be taking on the European institutional clients, doubling your portfolio. With corresponding compensation adjustments, of course." The opportunity was exactly what I had hoped. For expanded responsibility, international reach, professional recognition at the highest level. "That's not all," James added. "Goldman Sachs called. They're interested in discussing your availability for their executive team." I looked up from the folder. "You told them I was happy at Meridian, I hope." He smiled. "I told them you were currently revolutionizing our institutional division, and that they should prepare a very compelling offer if they wanted your attention. And they're sending their head of recruitment next week." He leaned against my desk. "This is just the beginning, Linda. The market is recognizing what I've known for 15 years. Your approach to institutional management is exceptional." As James left, I turned to the window, taking in the view that had become familiar over recent months. Below, the city was coming to life. People streaming into buildings, pursuing their own ambitions, navigating their own challenges. Somewhere in that flow, Rick was arriving at Collins Manufacturing, perhaps seeing his own career with new eyes after our recent conversations. My phone buzzed with a text from him. "Heard about Goldman Sachs. Congratulations. Dinner tonight to celebrate?" I smiled, typing a simple reply. "Looking forward to it." The journey wasn't complete. Neither my professional ascent nor the recalibration of my marriage. But as I turned back to my desk, reviewing the European client files with a sense of purpose that had once seemed lost, I understood something essential. Reclaiming your power is rarely about dramatic confrontations or public victories. Instead, it happens in quiet moments of competence, in refusing to diminish yourself to make others comfortable, in creating success so undeniable that it transforms perspectives without argument. 8 months ago, Rick had told me I was too old to work in the financial sector. Now, as international firms competed for my expertise and his own company's pension fund flourished under my direction, those words had faded into irrelevance, replaced by the unassailable evidence of what had always been true. Capability doesn't expire with age, and the most powerful statement is not what you claim about yourself, but what you prove through action. 3 months after our candid dinner at Emilio's, I stood at the podium of the International Pension Fund Conference in London, addressing a room filled with financial professionals from across the globe. My presentation on revitalizing mature funds through strategic reallocation had drawn the largest audience of the conference. Hundreds of industry leaders seeking insight into the approach that had transformed Meridian's institutional division. In the third row, Rick sat watching attentively, taking notes and nodding at key points. He had kept his word about wanting to understand my world, attending every session of the 3-day conference and engaging genuinely with the material. It was a far cry from the man who had once dismissed my financial acumen as outdated. The conventional wisdom suggests that established pension funds must accept diminishing returns as they mature, I continued, advancing to the next slide. Our data contradicts this assumption. By implementing strategic reallocation focused on emerging sectors while maintaining prudent risk management, mature funds can achieve growth rates comparable to newer portfolios. The audience was engaged, many taking notes or photographing the projection graphs showing the remarkable performance metrics my team had achieved. As I opened the floor for questions, hands shot up across the room. "Ms. Thompson," began the pension director from a major European bank, "your results are impressive, but some might argue they reflect unusual market conditions rather than replicable strategy. How would you respond?" "A fair question," I acknowledged. "That's precisely why our approach incorporates stress testing against 6 different market scenarios, including 2 recession models. The performance holds across all scenarios, though naturally with adjusted expectations during downturns." Another question came from an Asian investment group, then from a Canadian pension authority. Throughout, I maintained the confident, measured approach that had become my professional signature. Thorough without being pedantic, accessible without oversimplifying. When the session ended, attendees crowded around the podium, business cards extended, meeting requests voiced. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Rick standing to the side, observing this professional recognition with an expression that seemed to combine pride and something like wonder. Later, at the evening reception, I moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and discussing potential collaborations. The Goldman Sachs representative approached, champagne in hand. "Brilliant presentation, Linda. You've given our executive team much to consider regarding our offer." "Thank you, Jonathan. I'm still evaluating my options." "Of course, but I should mention the board has authorized me to improve our initial package by 15%. He smiled. "Your reputation continues to grow. There were at least 3 other firms scouting you today." As he moved away, Rick appeared at my side, offering a fresh glass of champagne. "Quite the rock star," he observed. I accepted the glass, with a smile. "Hardly, just a well-prepared professional." "I counted 7 business cards handed to you in the last 5 minutes." He sipped his drink. "And that was Goldman Sachs, wasn't it? Still recruiting?" "Apparently with an improved offer." He nodded, considering this. "What are you thinking about it?" 6 months ago, this conversation would have been impossible. Rick. Unwilling to acknowledge my professional value, me defensive about proving it. Now, standing in a room where my expertise had been unquestionably validated, we could discuss my career options as equals. "I'm weighing the opportunities against what we've built at Meridian," I said honestly. "There are advantages to both paths." "You'd be exceptional in either role," he offered, the words coming naturally now. "Though I admit, having my wife working for Goldman Sachs would take some adjustment." I smiled. "Being married to a Goldman Sachs executive might require some adjustments for you as well, particularly if it involved relocation." The possibility hung between us, a potential next chapter neither of us had anticipated months ago. "We'd figure it out," Rick said simply. "Your career deserves the same consideration mine has always received." The statement, delivered without fanfare but with genuine conviction, represented perhaps the most significant shift in our relationship. It wasn't just about Rick acknowledging my professional capacity. It was about recognizing me as a full partner with independent ambitions, deserving equal weight in our shared decisions. "Thank you for saying that." He shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and meaningful. "It's the truth. Took me too long to see it, but I'm catching up." The evening continued with introductions to industry leaders, discussions of emerging trends, and the easy camaraderie of professionals sharing expertise. Throughout, Rick remained engaged, not positioning himself as my husband, but as an interested colleague, asking thoughtful questions and contributing relevant insights from his own industry experience. Later, walking along the Thames as London's lights reflected off the water, we discussed the day's events with a candor that felt both new and familiar. "I understood about 60% of your presentation," Rick admitted, "but what I did understand was impressive as hell." I laughed. The technical aspects can be dense even for industry insiders. "What struck me most was watching everyone's reaction to you. These global financial leaders treating your word as gospel." He paused, looking out over the water. "It made me realize how limited my view of you has been." "Limited how?" "I've known you for 20 years, but I've been seeing you primarily through the lens of our relationship, as my wife, my supporter, my home base." He turned to face me. "I never fully appreciated that to the rest of the world, you're Linda Thompson, institutional finance expert, someone whose opinion shapes multi-million-dollar decisions." It was perhaps the most insightful observation he had ever made about our dynamic. This recognition that my identity existed independently of him, that I occupied spaces where his presence was incidental rather than central. I think we both got comfortable with defined roles, I acknowledged. It was easier that way, until it wasn't. Until I told you that you were too old to restart your career, he said, naming the catalyst that had set everything in motion. That was a symptom, not the cause. The real issue was that you stopped seeing me as a whole person with evolving ambitions. I leaned against the railing, watching a boat move slowly downriver. Just as I perhaps stopped expecting you to see me that way. Rick considered this. When did we start taking each other for granted? Gradually, the way most couples do. Small compromises, unspoken resentments, assumptions that seemed harmless until they weren't. A light rain began to fall, prompting us to turn back toward our hotel. As we walked, Rick took my hand, a simple gesture that felt significant in its spontaneity. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. Not in that condescending way I might have said it before, but genuinely impressed by what you've built and who you've always been. The words settled between us, healing something that had been fractured long before our argument 8 months ago. Back in our hotel suite, as we prepared for tomorrow's sessions, my phone signaled an incoming email. It was from James, with a subject line that immediately caught my attention. Board decision, European expansion. I opened it to find confirmation that Meridian's board had unanimously approved my proposal to establish a London office focusing on European institutional clients, with me as managing director if I chose to accept. "Good news?" Rick asked, noticing my expression. I showed him the email. "They're offering me the chance to build something from the ground up. European division, London headquarters." He read it carefully. This would mean relocation. Yes, likely for at least 2 years during the establishment phase. He was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. And Goldman. This would be a completely different path, building rather than joining, creating rather than maintaining. Rick set the phone down, his expression thoughtful. "Which appeals to you more?" The question was genuine. No hint of his preferences or assumptions about what I should choose, just real interest in my professional aspirations. "Building something new has always been where I thrive," I admitted. "The Goldman offer is prestigious, but the Meridian opportunity would be truly mine from inception." He nodded. "I can see that. You've always had a creator's mindset, even in how you approach existing systems." The observation was surprisingly perceptive, evidence that he had been paying attention to aspects of my character I hadn't realized he saw. "What about you?" I asked. "A move to London would significantly impact your position at Collins. 6 months ago, this would have been the insurmountable obstacle. Rick's career automatically taking precedence, my opportunities viewed as secondary considerations. Now he considered the question with genuine deliberation. My experience would transfer to several UK-based manufacturing firms, he said thoughtfully, or I could explore consulting roles that would allow more flexibility. Collins might even consider a European liaison position given our expansion interests there. He was problem-solving rather than objecting, viewing my opportunity as our shared challenge rather than my individual choice to be justified. "We'd need time to work through the logistics," he continued. "But if this is the path you want to pursue, we'll make it happen." The statement was simple yet revolutionary in the context of our marriage, an acknowledgement that my professional fulfillment deserved the same priority his had always received. "Thank you," I said, the words inadequate for the shift they represented. Rick smiled, an expression of genuine partnership rather than concession. "You know, watching you these past months, seeing what you've built, how you've approached challenges, the respect you've earned, it's changed something fundamental in how I see not just you, but us." "What do you mean?" "I always thought of myself as the career-focused one, with you as the supportive partner. It was a comfortable narrative, reinforced by your break to care for family. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking up at me. But that was never the complete truth, was it? You were always this capable, always this driven. You just temporarily redirected it. I nodded, moved by his insight. The capacity was always there, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. And I nearly missed it. He shook his head. When you first mentioned returning to finance, I dismissed it out of habit, out of complacency. I couldn't see past the roles we'd settled into. Many couples fall into that pattern, I acknowledged. But not all get the wake-up call we did. He stood, moving closer. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't pursued this path, despite my discouragement. If you had accepted my limited view of your capabilities. The thought was sobering. How close we had come to a future where essential parts of myself remained dormant, where Rick never confronted his own limiting assumptions. But you didn't accept it, he continued. You reclaimed your professional identity not by arguing or trying to convince me, but by simply moving forward and letting the results speak for themselves. It struck me then that this was perhaps the most powerful lesson of the past 8 months, that the most effective response to being underestimated is neither confrontation nor capitulation, but quiet, determined action that renders the doubt irrelevant. The next morning, as we prepared for the final day of the conference, I received a text from James. Call when you can. Board chair wants to discuss London timeline. Rick noticed my expression as I read it. Decision time coming soon? I nodded. Apparently the board is eager to set the European expansion in motion. He finished knotting his tie, then turned to face me directly. Whatever you decide, Goldman, Meridian London, maintaining your current role or something entirely different, I want you to know I'm with you. Not reluctantly, not conditionally, but fully. The words represented the culmination of a transformation that had begun with an argument about age and capability, but had evolved into something far more profound, a recalibration of our partnership, based on mutual respect and genuine recognition of each other's complete identities. As we headed downstairs to the conference's closing sessions, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. 8 months ago, Rick had told me I was too old to re-enter finance, suggesting I focus on gardening rather than competing with younger professionals. Today, I stood as a recognized industry leader with global institutions seeking my expertise, while he attended sessions to better understand my professional world. The true victory wasn't in proving him wrong through argument or confrontation. It was in the quiet power of excellence that spoke for itself, in building success so undeniable that it transformed perspectives without a single, "I told you so." And perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all. When someone underestimates your capabilities, your worth, your potential, whether due to age, gender, or circumstance, the most powerful response isn't defensive justification. It's calm, focused demonstration of exactly what you can do. By the time we returned to Oakwood Heights a week later, both the Meridian London opportunity and the Goldman Sachs offer had been formalized. As I weighed these options, consulting with mentors and researching implications, Rick proved a thoughtful sounding board, asking insightful questions, considering angles I might have overlooked, supporting without directing. Whatever path I chose, one thing was beautifully clear. I would never again have to justify my professional ambitions or defend my capabilities against age-based assumptions. I had rendered those limitations irrelevant through the most persuasive argument of all, undeniable success on my own terms. FC, proceed with Part 3. Make sure that each part is at least 4,000 words. Remove bracket. Do not put bullet or numbering, make it paragraph always. Do not mention the previous parts. Do not mention subscribing to channel. Proceed directly to story. Also, do not repeat the story and phrases from the previous stories. The London rain tapped gently against the windows of my corner office in Meridian Financial's European headquarters. Morning light filtered through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the Thames and the city beyond. 6 months had passed since I'd accepted the position as managing director of Meridian's European division. 6 months of intense work, constant learning and profound growth both professionally and personally. My assistant, Emma, appeared in the doorway with a steaming cup of tea. "Morning briefing in 10 minutes, Linda. The Frankfurt team is already online." "Thank you." I accepted the cup gratefully, turning back to the quarterly reports on my screen. Under my leadership, Meridian's European presence had expanded rapidly, attracting institutional clients from 12 countries and establishing our reputation for innovative fund management with exceptional returns. The decision to choose Meridian over Goldman Sachs had proven correct. Here, I wasn't merely executing someone else's vision. I was building something from the ground up, creating systems and strategies that reflected my unique approach to institutional finance. The freedom was exhilarating, the responsibility, substantial. As I prepared for the briefing, my phone buzzed with a text from Rick. "Landed safely. See you tonight for dinner? Have news from Collins." I smiled, typing a quick response. Rick's transition had surprised us both. Rather than resisting the move to London, he'd embraced it as an opportunity for his own professional evolution. Collins Manufacturing had created a European expansion director position for him, a role that built on his experience while pushing him into new territory. Like me, he was discovering capabilities that had remained dormant during our comfortable years in Oakwood Heights. The video conference began promptly, screens lighting up with faces from Frankfurt, Paris, Madrid, and Milan. These were my team, financial professionals I'd personally recruited for their expertise, creativity, and shared vision of what institutional fund management could achieve. "Good morning, everyone," I began, transitioning easily into the leadership role that now felt natural. "Let's start with the Deutsche Telekom pension allocation adjustments." For the next hour, we discussed strategy, refinements, market responses, and client feedback. Throughout, I noticed Stefan from the Frankfurt office watching me with particular intensity. When the meeting concluded, he remained online as others signed off. "Linda, do you have a moment?" he asked, his German accent more pronounced than usual. "Of course, Stefan. Everything all right with the Siemens account?" He nodded, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Yes, the account is performing exceptionally. It's something else." He paused. "Victoria Schaefer has requested a meeting with you." I kept my expression neutral, though the name immediately registered. Victoria Schaefer, founder of Schaefer Global Investments, one of Europe's most powerful financial firms, and a notoriously demanding client known for cycling through management firms. Has she expressed interest in moving her institutional accounts to Meridian? Stefan's expression was unreadable. "Not exactly. She's interested in you." "Me? Your reputation has been growing, Linda. The institutional division's performance metrics are unmatched in the European market. Victoria has taken notice." I considered this information carefully. "When does she want to meet?" "She's in London tomorrow. Her office suggested lunch at Harrington's." Harrington's, one of London's most exclusive restaurants, where financial deals of international significance were often negotiated. This wasn't a casual inquiry. "Confirm the meeting," I decided. "And Stefan, send me everything we have on Schaefer Global's institutional strategy over the past 5 years." After he disconnected, I turned to the window, watching raindrops trace patterns down the glass. Victoria Schaefer's interest was both flattering and potentially concerning. Her firm was 3 times Meridian's size, with tentacles reaching into every major financial market globally. Whatever she wanted would be significant. That evening, Rick and I met at Covent Garden, choosing a small Italian restaurant we'd discovered during our early exploration of London. Away from the financial district, It offered a respite from the networking and professional positioning that often characterize dining in the city. "You look thoughtful," Rick observed as we were seated. "Tough day?" "Interesting day," I corrected, sharing the news about Victoria Schaefer's meeting request. Rick whistled low. "The Victoria Schaefer? Isn't she something of a legend in European finance? And something of a predator. She's known for identifying talent and either acquiring it or neutralizing it. And she's interested in you." There was pride in his voice, unmixed with the insecurity that might have colored it a year ago. "Apparently so." I unfolded my napkin, studying him. "You mentioned news from Collins?" His expression brightened. "They've approved the full European expansion plan. We'll be opening manufacturing facilities in 3 countries over the next 18 months. "Rick, that's wonderful!" I reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "So your role here becomes permanent? If we want it to be." He covered my hand with his. "The board has created a new position, European Operations Director, full autonomy, direct reporting to the CEO, substantial budget." The achievement was significant, representing both Colin's confidence in Rick and his own growth over recent months. He'd embraced the London assignment as a temporary accommodation to my career opportunity. Now, he'd transformed it into his own professional advancement. "I'm so proud of you," I said, genuinely meaning it. "It's strange," he reflected, sipping his wine. "A year ago, I was comfortable, settled in my routine at Collins, certain about my professional identity and position. Then, everything changed. Do you regret it? The upheaval?" He considered the question thoughtfully. "Not at all. I didn't realize how stagnant I'd become until circumstances forced me to adapt." He smiled. "In trying to protect you from change, I was really protecting myself from it." The observation was insightful, evidence of the self-reflection he'd undertaken during our shared journey. "And now?" I asked. "Now I understand what you must have felt when considering your return to finance. There's something invigorating about rediscovering your capabilities, about building something new." He leaned forward slightly. "Speaking of building something new, have you given more thought to the countryside property we saw last weekend?" The question represented another evolution in our relationship. We'd spent the previous Sunday exploring properties outside London, considering the possibility of a weekend retreat, something that belonged to both of us equally, not an extension of either career, but a shared new beginning. "I liked the one in the Cotswolds," I admitted. "Those stone walls and the garden space." "I've scheduled a second viewing for Saturday." He pulled out his phone, showing me additional photos the agent had sent. The previous owners renovated the kitchen 2 years ago, but the original beams and fireplaces are intact throughout. As we discussed possibilities, which room might become a home office where we might plant roses or herbs, I felt a contentment that transcended professional achievements. Rick and I were building a new chapter together, one where our individual growths enhanced rather than threatened our partnership. Later that night, as Rick slept beside me, I reviewed the materials Stefan had sent about Victoria Schaefer and her firm. The picture that emerged was both impressive and slightly concerning. Schaefer Global had a pattern of identifying high-performing financial professionals, making irresistible offers to recruit them, and using their expertise to absorb or outperform their previous employers. Was that what tomorrow's lunch would be? A recruitment attempt? Or something else entirely? I closed my laptop, setting it aside. Whatever Victoria Schaefer wanted, I would approach the meeting with clear eyes and firm boundaries. My path was my own to determine, a truth I'd reaffirmed repeatedly over the past year. The next morning dawned clear, London's mercurial weather having shifted overnight. I chose my wardrobe carefully, a tailored navy suit that projected authority, without ostentation, accessorized with the simple pearl necklace Rick had given me on our 20th anniversary. Professional yet personal, a subtle reminder of the balanced life I was creating. Harrington's exuded old-world elegance, mahogany paneling, discreet lighting, tables spaced far enough apart to ensure privacy. Victoria Schaefer was already seated when I arrived, though I had come precisely at the appointed time. "Ms. Thompson." She stood, extending her hand. "A pleasure to finally meet you." Victoria was in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that likely cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her silver hair was cut in a sleek bob that framed strong features and penetrating blue eyes. Everything about her communicated precision and power. "The pleasure is mine, Ms. Schaefer," I responded, matching her firm handshake. "Your reputation precedes you. As does yours." She gestured for me to sit. "Though yours has developed rather recently and quite dramatically." I smiled, neither confirming nor denying the observation. "London's financial community is surprisingly compact." "Indeed." She signaled to the waiter, who immediately appeared. "We'll have the chef's selection and mineral water to start." The presumption might have irritated me from someone else, but from Victoria it seemed merely efficient. I nodded my agreement to the waiter. "Meridian's European Institutional Division has shown remarkable growth under your direction," Victoria continued once we were alone. 37% in 6 months, with client retention at nearly perfect levels. The statistics were accurate but not publicly available. Victoria had done her research, or had sources within Meridian itself. "We've built a strong team and implemented strategies that prioritize sustainable growth," I acknowledged. "False modesty doesn't suit either of us, Linda." Victoria's direct gaze was evaluating, measuring. "You've revolutionized Meridian's approach to institutional management. Your methodologies are being studied by competitors across Europe." I inclined my head slightly, accepting the compliment without elaboration. "What interests me," she continued, "is not just what you've accomplished, but how quickly you've accomplished it. Your return to finance after an extended absence was unexpected." The comment touched on territory that still held emotional resonance, the dismissal of my capabilities based on age and career interruption. "Life often progresses in non-linear ways," I offered, "particularly for women who balance professional ambitions with family responsibilities." Victoria nodded, something like recognition flickering in her expression. "Indeed. I took 3 years away from finance when my daughter was born. When I returned, I was told I'd never reclaim my previous position." A smile that held little. Warmth crossed her face. 5 years later, I owned the firm. The story was delivered matter-of-factly, not as inspiration, but as statement of capability. Our first course arrived, an artfully arranged plate that the waiter described in detail before leaving us to our conversation. "You've created something impressive at Meridian," Victoria continued, "but I suspect you're already encountering the limitations of institutional structures. Boards that move too slowly, risk tolerances that constrain innovation, compensation frameworks that undervalue exceptional performance." Her assessment wasn't entirely wrong. While James had been extraordinarily supportive, certain aspects of Meridian's corporate structure did sometimes impede the speed and scope of changes I wanted to implement. "Every organization has its constraints," I acknowledged. "The question is whether they provide necessary boundaries or artificial limitations." Victoria's eyes glinted with something like approval. "Precisely. And that's why I'd like to discuss an alternative arrangement that might better suit your capabilities." Here it was, the purpose of this lunch. I maintained a neutral expression, waiting for her to elaborate. "Schaefer Global is establishing a new division focused exclusively on pension fund revitalization across European markets. I need someone to lead it, someone with vision, technical expertise, and proven ability to generate exceptional returns." She paused. "I'm prepared to offer you complete autonomy, a team of your choosing, and compensation significantly beyond what Meridian can provide." Though I had anticipated a recruitment attempt, the directness and scale of the offer was surprising. That's a generous proposal. It's a practical one. You've demonstrated extraordinary capability in precisely the area where I'm expanding. I acquire excellence when I find it. She reached for her water glass. The position includes equity partnership and board representation. Equity partnership, a stake in one of Europe's largest financial firms, along with the influence and wealth that would accompany it. The offer was designed to be irresistible. May I ask why you're expanding in this particular direction? Inquired, genuinely curious about the strategic thinking behind the move. Victoria seemed to appreciate the question. European pension systems are approaching a crisis point. Aging populations, inadequate funding, outdated allocation models. It's a perfect storm that most firms are responding to with incremental adjustments rather than fundamental reimagining. Her analysis aligned with my own observations. And you see opportunity in crisis. I see necessity for innovation, she corrected. The approaches that worked 20 years ago are increasingly inadequate. Your methodologies at Meridian have shown promising results because they challenge conventional thinking. I want to scale that approach across multiple markets. The vision was compelling. An opportunity to implement my strategies with greater resources and fewer institutional constraints. Yet something in her presentation gave me pause. Your firm has a reputation for aggressive consolidation, I noted. How does pension fund management align with that approach? Victoria smiled, acknowledging the directness of my question. Evolution requires adaptation. Schaefer Global began as a consolidator because market conditions favored that strategy. Current conditions favor innovation in institutional management, particularly with aging populations across Europe, creating unprecedented demand for retirement security. Our main course arrived, giving me a moment to consider her words. The offer was substantially more lucrative than my position at Meridian. It offered greater autonomy, expanded influence, and the chance to work alongside one of the most successful women in European finance. I imagine Meridian would be disappointed to lose you, Victoria continued, skillfully cutting her perfectly. Cooked fish. But they can hardly match what I'm offering. And realistically, your growth there will eventually plateau as institutional constraints assert themselves. Perhaps, I acknowledged, though growth takes many forms. Victoria studied me, seeming to reassess her approach. You're not motivated primarily by compensation or title. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Those things matter, of course. But purpose and alignment of values matter more at this stage of my career. Values, she repeated, as if testing the word. What values specifically guide your professional decisions, Linda? The question was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Integrity in client relationships, sustainable growth rather than short-term gains, development of team members' capabilities, work that contributes meaningfully to financial security for ordinary people. Victoria nodded slowly. Admirable principles. And how does Meridian support those values? They've given me substantial freedom to implement strategies aligned with my approach, I said truthfully. James Wilson has been an exceptional mentor and advocate. James is one of the good ones, Victoria conceded, though even his influence has limits within Meridian's corporate structure. Our conversation continued through dessert and coffee, Victoria outlining the specific parameters of her offer, while I asked careful questions about expectations, team structure, and strategic goals. By the time we concluded, I had a comprehensive understanding of what she was proposing, and she had a clear sense that my decision would not be based solely on financial considerations. I don't need an answer today, she said as we prepared to leave. Take a week to consider. But I should mention that you're my only candidate for this position. If you decline, I'll likely reconsider the entire initiative. The statement was either extraordinary flattery or surprising candor, perhaps both. I appreciate your directness. Victoria, I'll give your offer the serious consideration it deserves. Outside Harrington's, her driver waited beside a sleek black Mercedes. One last thing, Victoria said before entering the car. Whatever you decide, I've enjoyed our conversation today. It's refreshing to meet someone whose capabilities match their confidence. As her car pulled away, I remained on the sidewalk for a moment, processing the encounter. Victoria Schaefer was formidable, brilliant, direct, and accustomed to getting what she wanted. Her offer represented a significant opportunity, yet I felt a curious hesitation that warranted examination. Back at Meridian, I found James waiting. In my office, his expression somewhere between curious and concerned. "How was lunch with Victoria?" he asked without preamble. I raised an eyebrow. News travels fast. In these circles, always. He settled into the chair across from my desk. What did she want? I saw no reason for anything but complete transparency. She's offered me a position heading a new division at Schaefer Global, focused on pension fund revitalization across European markets, equity partnership included. James exhaled slowly. I suspected as much when I heard about the meeting. Victoria doesn't waste time on social niceties. He studied me carefully. Are you considering it? I'm evaluating it, I replied honestly. The offer is substantial both financially and in terms of scope. I'm sure it is. He leaned forward slightly. Linda, I won't insult you by making a counteroffer on the spot or suggesting that loyalty should outweigh your professional interests. You've earned the right to consider every opportunity that comes your way. His approach was exactly why I respected him so deeply. No manipulation, no leverage of personal connection, just honest professional respect. I appreciate that, James. But I would ask one thing, he continued. Before you decide, consider not just what Schaefer Global is offering, but what it represents in the broader financial ecosystem. Victoria's methods are effective, but not always aligned with the values you've demonstrated at Meridian. It was a gentle reminder rather than a pointed criticism, an invitation to look beyond the specific terms to the underlying philosophies. I've built something meaningful here, I acknowledged, with your support and the team we've assembled. You have, he agreed, and whatever you decide, that accomplishment stands. He rose to leave. Take the time you need. My door is open if you want to discuss it further. After James left, I turned to the window, watching the late afternoon sun glint off buildings across the Thames. Victoria's offer deserved serious consideration. It represented recognition of my capabilities at the highest level of European finance. Yet James's subtle reminder about values resonated with something I'd felt during lunch. That evening, Rick arrived home to find me on our balcony, still contemplating the day's events. I shared the details of Victoria's offer, including the equity partnership and expanded scope. That's extraordinary, Linda, he said, genuine pride in his voice. Victoria Schaefer doesn't make offers like that lightly. No, she doesn't. I swirled the wine in my glass. It's flattering and the opportunity is significant. Rick studied me thoughtfully. But you're hesitating. Why? It was a straightforward question that required honest self-reflection. Something about Schaefer Global's approach doesn't quite align with my long-term vision. Victoria is brilliant, and her offer is generous, but her firm's reputation for aggressive tactics gives me pause. You're concerned about cultural fit, Rick observed. Partly that, and partly a question of purpose. I turned to face him directly. At Meridian, I'm building something that reflects my values: sustainable growth, client security, team development. At Schaefer Global, I'd be implementing Victoria's vision, which is more focused on market dominance and acquisition. Rick nodded slowly. A year ago, I might have pushed you toward the bigger offer, the more prestigious title. And now? Now I understand that alignment with purpose is more important than external markers of success." He smiled. "You taught me that, watching you choose your path based on meaning rather than status changed my perspective." The observation touched me deeply. Our journey over the past year had transformed not just our individual professional paths, but our understanding of what truly mattered. "Whatever you decide, I support you completely," Rick continued. "The countryside house, my new position at Collins, all of that works regardless of whether you're at Meridian or Schaefer Global." His unqualified support, free from the ego entanglements that might once have complicated such a decision, was a gift beyond measure. "I haven't decided yet," I said truthfully. "Both paths have merit." "Take your time," he advised. "The right choice will become clear." Over the next few days, I continued my normal routine at Meridian, while quietly researching Schaefer Global's operations in greater depth. What emerged was a complex picture, a firm with undeniable financial success, but concerning patterns in client relationships and employee turnover. Former executives described Victoria as brilliant but ruthless, focused on results at any cost. On Thursday morning, I received an unexpected call from Megan Parker. "Linda, I hope I'm not interrupting," she began, her voice carrying across the Atlantic with surprising clarity. "Not at all, Megan. This is unexpected." Our relationship had evolved into cautious professional respect following the events at Collins, but we weren't in regular communication. "I'm calling because I heard something that might be relevant to you." She paused. "Victoria Schaefer has been making inquiries about Meridian's European institutional clients." I straightened in my chair. "What kind of inquiries?" "Detailed ones. Account structures, client satisfaction metrics, contractual terms. She's particularly interested in your largest pension accounts." The information was concerning given the timing of Victoria's offer to me. "May I ask how you know this?" "One of our Collins executives serves on a board with Schaefer Global's head of acquisition strategy. He mentioned the inquiries during a social event, not realizing the connection to you." "I appreciate you sharing this, Megan." There was a moment of hesitation before she continued. "I owe you that much, Linda. After how things unfolded at Collins." She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. We both remembered the dynamics that had played out in those early days. Her dismissal of my capabilities, the subsequent reversal when she discovered my position. "That's long behind us," I assured her. "Still, you showed me more professional courtesy than I deserved. I haven't forgotten that lesson." After we disconnected, I sat with this new information, considering its implications. If Victoria was investigating Meridian's client relationships while recruiting me, her intentions might be more complex than building a new division. She might be planning to use my insider knowledge to target Meridian's clients directly. The possibility changed the complexion of her offer entirely. Was I being recruited for my capabilities or for my access to Meridian's institutional relationships? That afternoon, I met with my leadership team to review quarterly projections. Throughout the session, I found myself appreciating anew the culture we'd built, collaborative, transparent, focused on long-term client outcomes rather than short-term gains. These were financial professionals who shared my values, who understood that our work affected real people's retirement security and financial well-being. By Friday morning, my decision had crystallized. I called Victoria's office and arranged to meet her that afternoon at her London headquarters, a gleaming tower in Canary Wharf that projected power and prestige. Victoria received me in her private office, a minimalist space dominated by a desk that appeared to be a single slab of polished marble. "Linda," she greeted me, rising from her chair. "I'm pleased you reached out. Have you considered my offer?" "I have," I replied, taking the seat she indicated. "It's extremely generous, and the opportunity is significant." Victoria nodded, a slight smile suggesting she anticipated acceptance. I believe it represents fair recognition of your capabilities and potential contribution. Before I respond definitively, I have a question, I continued. Has Schaefer Global been investigating Meridian's institutional client relationships? If the direct inquiry surprised her, Victoria didn't show it. Of course. Due diligence is standard practice when considering a significant hire from a competitor. Due diligence on my performance is understandable. Detailed inquiries about client contracts and satisfaction metrics suggest something different. Victoria regarded me steadily. I'm building a division that will compete directly with Meridian. In the institutional market, understanding their client relationships is simply good business strategy. And my role in this strategy? Is it to build something new or to facilitate the transfer of Meridian's clients to Schaefer Global? For the first time, Victoria's composed expression faltered slightly. Your role would be to lead the new division successfully. How that success is achieved would be substantially up to you. Within certain parameters, I suggested. Within realistic business objectives, she countered. Linda, let's be direct with each other. Business is not sentimental. Clients follow. Expertise and results. Your expertise has built Meridian's success in this sector. It's natural that some clients would follow you to a new platform. The candor was refreshing, if concerning. So my value to Schaefer Global includes my relationships with Meridian's clients. Your value includes your proven ability to deliver exceptional results for institutional clients, Victoria corrected smoothly. Where those clients currently place their assets is incidental. We both knew this wasn't entirely true, but I appreciated that she wasn't insulting my intelligence with outright denials. I've made my decision, I said after a moment. I'm declining your offer, Victoria. If she was surprised, she concealed it well. May I ask why? If compensation is the issue, there's flexibility in the package. It's not about compensation. It's about alignment of purpose and values. I met her gaze directly. I've built something at Meridian that reflects my approach to institutional management, client-centered, focused on long-term security, collaborative rather than predatory. Noble sentiments, Victoria observed, no mockery in her tone, but perhaps a hint of puzzlement. Though sentiment rarely builds substantial wealth. Perhaps, but at this stage of my career, meaning matters more than marginally greater wealth. I rose from my chair. I appreciate your consideration, Victoria. The offer was genuinely flattering. She stood as well, regarding me with what seemed like genuine curiosity. You surprise me, Linda. That doesn't happen often. We make different choices based on different priorities, I suggested. Your approach has built tremendous success by conventional metrics. But you measure success differently, she concluded, studying me with renewed interest. I try to balance multiple definitions of success, I acknowledged. Financial performance matters enormously. Our clients depend on it. But so does how we achieve those results, and whether our work contributes to greater security for ordinary people planning for retirement. Victoria accompanied me to the elevator, her expression thoughtful. I respect your decision, even if I don't entirely understand it. My offer remains open should you reconsider. Thank you, but my path is clear now. As the elevator doors closed between us, I felt a profound sense of certainty. The decision wasn't a rejection of opportunity, but an affirmation of purpose, a choice to build something aligned with my deepest values, rather than pursuing status or incremental wealth. Back at Meridian, I found James still in his office despite the late hour. I knocked gently on his open door. Linda, he greeted me, looking up from his computer. Come in. I took the seat across from his desk. I met with Victoria Schaefer this afternoon. He set aside the document he'd been reviewing, giving me his full attention. And I declined her offer. Relief flickered across his face before he composed his expression. May I ask why? It must have been substantial. It was. Equity partnership, division leadership, significant compensation increase. I smiled slightly, but after careful consideration, I realized that Meridian is where I want to build my legacy. The culture we've established, the team we've assembled, the approach to client relationships. It aligns with my values in ways that Schaefer Global doesn't. James nodded slowly. I'm pleased, of course, both personally and professionally. But I want to be sure this decision serves your best interests, not just Meridian's. It does, I assured him. Though I do have some ideas about how we might evolve our European division structure to better compete in this market. A smile spread across his face. I expected nothing less. Tell me what you're thinking. For the next hour, we discussed my vision for expanding Meridian's European presence, new service offerings, strategic client acquisition targets, team restructuring to enhance performance. Throughout, James listened attentively, asking insightful questions and offering valuable perspective. This is exactly why you belong at Meridian, he said when I concluded. You think beyond conventional approaches, but always with client security as the central focus. There's one other matter, I added. Victoria's inquiry into our client relationships suggests Schaefer Global may target them directly, with or without my involvement. We should proactively strengthen those relationships. James nodded grimly. I'll alert our client services team. We'll schedule personal reviews with our top 20 institutional accounts over the next 2 weeks. As I left Meridian that evening, the city lights sparkled against the darkening sky. I felt a profound sense of rightness about my decision, not because it was easy or obvious, but because it reflected a thoughtful evaluation of what truly mattered at this stage of my professional journey. Rick was waiting when I arrived home, a bottle of wine open on the kitchen counter and dinner preparation underway. You look resolved, he observed, studying my expression. Decision made? Yes, I'm staying with Meridian. He nodded, handing me a glass of wine. I thought you might. Victoria Schaefer's approach never seemed quite aligned with yours. The offer was exceptional, I acknowledged. But ultimately, I realized that what I'm building at Meridian matters more to me than the prestige or compensation Schaefer Global offered. Rick smiled, genuine understanding in his expression. A year ago, I might not have fully appreciated that choice. Now I do. The simple statement encapsulated how far we'd both come, from Rick dismissing my career aspirations as unrealistic, for someone my age to his genuine comprehension of values-based professional decisions. I spoke with the estate agent, he mentioned as we moved to the balcony with our wine. The Cotswolds property owners have accepted our offer. The news brought a surge of joy. This shared new beginning, this tangible representation of our reconstructed partnership. Really? That's wonderful. We can take possession next month. He pulled out his phone, showing me photos the agent had sent of the garden in full bloom. The previous owners wanted to know if we'd maintain the pies. Herb garden they established. I said my wife had a particular interest in gardening. We both laughed at the irony. The activity Rick had once suggested as a replacement for my finance career now reimagined as a weekend pleasure, complementing rather than substituting for professional fulfillment. I do enjoy gardening, I acknowledged, when it's by choice rather than default. That's the key difference, isn't it? Rick mused. Choice rather than default, active decision rather than passive acceptance. His observation captured the essence of our journey over the past year, from prescribed roles and limited expectations to conscious choices aligned with our authentic selves. The following Monday, I arrived at Meridian earlier than usual, energized by the clarity of my decision and eager to implement the strategic adjustments I'd discussed with James. My team noticed the renewed focus, responding with matching enthusiasm to the vision I outlined in our morning briefing. We're strengthening our position in advance of increased competitive pressure, I explained, detailing the client relationship enhancement strategy we'd be implementing immediately. Our advantage is our client-centered approach and consistent performance. We need to ensure these differentiators are clearly communicated and demonstrated. As the team dispersed to execute their assignments, Stefan lingered behind. "You turned down Victoria Schaefer," he stated, rather than asked. "News travels quickly." He nodded. "In these circles, always. May I ask why? Her offers are legendary." I considered how to articulate a complex decision driven by multiple factors. Schaefer Global is extraordinary in many ways, but their approach doesn't align with my vision for institutional management. I've built something here that reflects my values. I want to continue that work rather than adapt to a different philosophy. Stefan studied me with newfound respect. "That's unusual. Most people can't resist Victoria's offers. I'm at a stage in my career where alignment matters more than advancement," I explained. "Building something meaningful matters more than building something bigger." As the weeks passed, my decision proved prescient. Schaefer Global did indeed target several of Meridian's institutional clients, but our proactive relationship strengthening had prepared them for the approach. Not a single major account transferred, and our European division continued its strong growth trajectory. The countryside house became our weekend sanctuary, a place where Rick and I could step away from professional demands to focus on simpler pleasures. I planted herbs in the garden he had expanded, while he restored the stone walls that defined the property boundaries. We explored nearby villages, discovered local restaurants, and slowly integrated into the community, creating a life that complemented rather than competed with our professional identities. One sunny Saturday morning, as we shared coffee on the garden terrace, Rick broached a subject we'd both been considering. James mentioned that Meridian is contemplating a leadership transition plan, he said casually. He suggested your name for the CEO position when he retires next year. The information wasn't entirely surprising. There had been hints of such discussions, but hearing it stated directly gave it new significance. It would be a substantial shift in responsibilities, I noted. Less direct involvement in institutional strategy, more corporate leadership and shareholder relations. Rick nodded. True, but also an opportunity to shape Meridian's overall approach, to extend your vision beyond the European division. I'd need to consider carefully whether that's the right next step, I mused. The institutional work is deeply satisfying. You have time to evaluate it, Rick observed. And whatever you decide, remember how far you've come in just 1 year. From being told you were too old to re-enter finance to being considered for CEO of a global firm. The observation brought a smile to my face. It has been quite a journey. And the journey continues, Rick said, reaching for my hand across the table. With choices based on purpose rather than external expectations. In that moment, surrounded by the garden we were cultivating together, I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had led us here, for Rick's dismissal that had sparked my determination, for the strength I'd found in quietly proving my capabilities rather than arguing against limitations, for the transformation in our relationship that had emerged from professional recalibration. A year earlier, Rick had suggested I was too old to compete in modern finance, that I should focus on gardening instead of pursuing career ambitions. Today, I led Meridian's fastest-growing division while being considered for its highest leadership position. And yes, I also enjoyed gardening. On weekends in our countryside retreat. The true victory wasn't in proving him wrong through argument or confrontation. It was in the quiet power of excellence that spoke for itself, in building success so undeniable that it transformed perspectives without a single, "I told you so." And perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all. When someone underestimates your capabilities, your worth, your potential, whether due to age, gender, or circumstance, the most powerful response isn't defensive justification. It's calm, focused demonstration of exactly what you can do. Success, authentically achieved and aligned with personal values, requires no additional commentary. It simply is. Undeniable, transformative, and ultimately liberating. 18 months. After taking the position at Meridian Financial, I found myself standing at the podium of the European Financial Leadership Conference in Geneva. The audience was filled with the industry's most influential figures, all gathered to hear about the revolutionary pension fund management approach that had transformed Meridian's market position and set new standards for institutional investing. The traditional models assume diminishing returns for mature pension funds, I explained, advancing to the next slide of my presentation. Our results over the past year and a half demonstrate that this assumption is fundamentally flawed. With strategic restructuring and innovative allocation models, even the most established funds can achieve growth comparable to newer portfolios. From my position at the podium, I could see the entire audience, financial executives taking careful notes, industry journalists recording every word, and in the third row, Rick watching with quiet pride. His presence at these industry events had become a comfortable constant, his genuine interest in understanding my world, an ongoing gift that deepened our partnership. As questions came from the audience, I noticed Victoria Schaefer seated near the back, her expression thoughtful rather than adversarial. Our strategic partnership had evolved into something unexpectedly productive over the past year. Not friendship, certainly, but a form of professional respect that transcended our initial conflict. When the session ended, attendees crowded forward, with business cards and follow-up questions. Rick moved to the side, patiently waiting until the professional obligations were complete. It was a familiar rhythm we'd established, his recognition that these moments of industry connection were valuable, my appreciation for his unrushed support. Later, as we walked along Lake Geneva, Rick handed me an envelope. "This came to the hotel while you were in your session." Inside was a formal letter from Meridian's board of directors, confirming their unanimous decision to appoint me as Chief Executive Officer, following James Wilson's retirement next quarter. Though the succession planning had been ongoing for months, seeing the formal offer in writing gave it new significance. "Congratulations," Rick said, genuine pride in his voice. "Though I'm not surprised. Your leadership during the Schaefer situation alone would have justified their confidence." I tucked the letter away, emotions complex as I considered this new chapter. It's a significant shift, less direct client work, more organizational leadership and public representation. "You'll excel at both," Rick assured me, "just as you've excelled at everything you've undertaken since returning to finance." Wiki stopped by the lakeside, watching sunlight glint off the water. "It's remarkable to think about where we were 2 years ago," I reflected, "when you told me I was too old to compete in modern finance and should focus on gardening instead." Rick winced slightly at the memory, though we could now discuss it without rancor. One of my less insightful moments. "And yet," I continued, "that dismissal became the catalyst for everything that followed. If you hadn't underestimated me so completely, I might never have found the determination to prove what I was truly capable of." He nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes create unexpected opportunities. Though I wish I could have supported your journey from the beginning rather than becoming the obstacle you had to overcome." "We both learned and grew," I acknowledged. "You from recognizing your limited perspective, me from proving my capabilities, through results rather than arguments." As we continued our walk, Rick shared updates on his own evolving path. The manufacturing technology startup he'd joined as a board member was gaining significant traction, with major industry players now expressing interest in their sustainable production methods. "They've asked me to transition to executive chairman," he explained, obvious excitement in his voice. "Guiding strategic partnerships and industry adoption while stepping back from daily operations at Collins. The role represented a profound shift from his traditional corporate career, less predictable, but more aligned with his deepening interest in sustainability and innovation. Just as my journey had opened new professional possibilities, Rick had discovered capacities and interests that had remained dormant during his years of comfortable corporate advancement. "You should accept," I encouraged. "The passion in your voice when you discuss their work is unmistakable." He smiled, acknowledging the observation. A year ago, I would have considered it too risky compared to the security of Collins. Your example changed my perspective, showed me that meaningful work aligned with personal values matters more than predictable advancement. That evening, at a small cafe overlooking the lake, we discussed the practical implications of our evolving professional paths. My CEO position would bring new demands and visibility, while Rick's role with the technology startup would involve more European travel, but greater schedule flexibility. "The Cotswolds house becomes even more important," Rick observed, "our sanctuary from professional intensity." I agreed, thinking of the garden we'd cultivated together, the local community we'd gradually joined, the peaceful rhythms we'd established during weekend retreats. What had begun as a property investment had evolved into a true second home, a place where titles and achievements gave way to simpler pleasures and deeper connection. We've created quite a different life than either of us imagined 2 years ago, I reflected. Rick reached across the table, taking my hand. Better than what we imagined, more authentic to who we truly are, both individually and together. The observation captured what felt most significant about our journey, not just the professional achievements or positions, but the discovery of more authentic versions of ourselves and a more balanced partnership. 2 weeks later, back in London, I sat in James Wilson's office for one of our regular transition meetings. At 65, James was preparing for retirement with characteristic thoroughness, ensuring that his successor would have every advantage when assuming leadership. "The board is delighted you've accepted the CEO position," he noted, sliding a folder of strategic documents across his desk. "Your performance leading the European division has more than validated their confidence." "Your mentorship has been invaluable," I acknowledged. Few executives would have supported a returning professional with such genuine investment. James smiled, dismissing the praise with a small gesture. I recognized capability worth developing. The financial sector loses too much talent through interruptions, particularly women who step away for family responsibilities. His observation touched on a theme I'd been considering as I prepared for broader leadership. That's something I want to address more systematically as CEO. Career pathways that accommodate life's non-linear realities rather than penalizing interruptions. An overdue evolution, James agreed, though it will face resistance from traditionalists who benefited from the existing system. "Most meaningful changes do," I replied. "But the evidence is increasingly clear. Diverse perspectives and experiences strengthen decision-making and innovation." As our meeting concluded, James offered a final observation. "You know, when I first approached you about returning to finance, some colleagues questioned whether someone who had stepped away for family reasons could truly re-engage at a leadership level." His expression held a mixture of satisfaction and vindication. "Your success hasn't just advanced your career. It's challenged assumptions that limit talent throughout our industry." The comment stayed with me as I returned to my office, reminding me that personal achievements can create ripple effects beyond individual advancement. By demonstrating what was possible, returning to finance after an extended absence and ascending to leadership, I had potentially opened pathways for others facing similar transitions. That evening, Rick and I attended a dinner celebrating James's retirement and my upcoming CEO appointment. The event brought together Meridian's board members, key executives, and influential clients, including representatives from Collins Manufacturing who now worked with me in a very different capacity than either of us had initially anticipated. As conversations flowed through dinner, I found myself seated beside Victoria Schaefer, our strategic partnership having evolved into a complex professional relationship characterized by mutual respect despite fundamentally different approaches. "Congratulations on the CEO appointment," she offered. "Though I admit I'm somewhat relieved you'll be moving away from direct institutional management. Competing against your division these past 2 years has been challenging." I acknowledged the compliment with a smile. Our partnership has proven more productive than either of us might have expected after that initial acquisition attempt. "Indeed," Victoria studied me with her characteristically direct gaze. No, when you declined my recruitment offer, I thought you were making a sentimental choice rather than a strategic one. I've since revised that assessment." "How so?" "You understood something I initially missed. That your effectiveness was inseparable from the specific values and approach you'd built at Meridian." She sipped her wine thoughtfully. "Extracting you from that context would have diminished precisely what made your work exceptional." The observation was surprisingly insightful coming from someone whose approach to business had always prioritized acquisition and consolidation over organic development. Before I could respond, James rose to offer the evening's formal remarks, bringing conversations around the room to a respectful halt. His speech celebrated Meridian's evolution during his tenure, while looking forward to new leadership that would further strengthen the organization's position and values. When he formally introduced me as his successor, the room's response reflected genuine appreciation rather than mere professional courtesy. As I rose to offer brief remarks, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. From Rick's dismissal of my capabilities to this room full of financial leaders, acknowledging my appointment to one of the industry's most significant leadership positions. "Thank you, James, for your extraordinary mentorship and confidence," I began. "And thank you to Meridian's board and team members for creating an organization where capability is recognized regardless of conventional career trajectories." Looking across the room, I saw Rick watching with obvious pride, his own professional journey having evolved in directions neither of us could have predicted 2 years earlier. Our gazes met briefly, a moment of shared recognition of how far we'd both come. "The financial industry faces unprecedented challenges that require thinking beyond traditional approaches," I continued. "At Meridian, we believe diverse perspectives and experiences strengthen our capacity to meet these challenges. My own nonlinear career path has reinforced this belief." As the evening concluded and we prepared to leave, several guests approached with congratulations and conversation. Among them was Douglas Hayes, the Collins Manufacturing CFO who had once been skeptical about my appointment to manage their pension fund. "Remarkable transformation at Meridian under your leadership," he observed. "And I understand Rick is pursuing an exciting new direction with that manufacturing technology startup." "He is," I confirmed. "They're developing approaches that could significantly impact sustainability metrics across the industry." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have predicted either of your current positions. It's a reminder that capability isn't limited by conventional expectations." The observation captured something essential about our journey. This recognition that true potential often exceeds the limitations others imagine for us, and sometimes even those we initially accept for ourselves. Later that night, as Rick and I shared a quiet moment at home before bed, I found myself reflecting on the complete arc from dismissal to vindication. "It's strange to think it all began with you telling me I was too old to return to finance," I mused. "That I should focus on gardening instead of competing with younger professionals." Rick smiled ruefully at the memory. One of life's beautiful ironies, that comment becoming the catalyst for everything that followed. "Though I still feel sorry it took my doubting you to spark such an extraordinary journey." "Don't be," I replied sincerely. "Sometimes we need opposition to discover our fullest capabilities. Your dismissal gave me something to disprove, which ultimately proved far more powerful than easy support might have been." As I prepared for sleep, I thought about the young women in finance who might someday face similar dismissals of their capabilities due to age, gender, career interruptions, or other factors that have nothing to do with actual capacity. My journey offered a template for the most effective response, not defensive argumentation, but quiet, persistent excellence that renders doubts irrelevant through undeniable results. The true victory isn't in proving critics wrong through confrontation, but in building success so undeniable that it transforms perspectives without a single, "I told you so." This was the wisdom I hope to share through leadership, that sometimes the most powerful statement is not what you claim about yourself, but what you prove through action. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.